Open Meetings Act posted here in the council chambers. If you now please join me in rising for a moment of silence in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, roll call, please.
Brandquist, Arns,
Here.
Merrill,
Here.
Murin,
Here.
Jackson,
Here.
Clausen,
Here.
Hildebrand.
Here.
Okay, with that, I would look for a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved. Second.
Motion and second. If no discussion, please vote.
All council members present voting in the affirmative, motion carries.
We now look for a motion to approve the full agenda.
So moved. Second.
Motion second. If no discussion, please vote.
All council members present voting in the affirmative, motion carries.
Takes us to our regular agenda, item number 11. I would look for a motion to approve consideration of the mayor's appointment of a qualified elector of Ward 4 to fill the vacancy for the balance of the unexpired term of Fred Weebelhaus.
So moved. Second.
Motion second. So I will now give a little background on why we're here in this process. Looks like Fred has joined us today. Again, as a reminder, Fred got a promotion in his job, and that required him to move to Lincoln. So we're losing him, and thank him for all his service and dedication to the Norfolk City Council and members of his ward in Ward 4. But that set in motion the appointment process for his replacement, and that is by Nebraska law, a pretty short and sweet process. So we did go to public notice on that about a week and a half ago and asked for applications from interested citizens. And we did receive 3 applicants, and each of these applicants, we were very pleased because it was a very talented group of candidates, and each accomplished and qualified in their own right. The 3 applicants were Zach Steiner, Ben Temple, and Andrew McCarthy. And I have decided to move Andrew McCarthy's appointment before the council. Given these reasons, I think Andrew exhibits a pretty unique combination that will help add value to the Norfolk City Council and help in our service to the citizens of Norfolk. And that combination includes direct experience in small business, being a small business entrepreneur, having worked in the service industry, which is a very important industry to our local economy, both through managing Big Red here for a number of years, but then going out on his own and starting his own operation, District Tap and Table, which is added to the growing diversity of our downtown district and is helping bring people to our community. Also, Andrew has demonstrated his community involvement by serving on the museum board, being active with groups like the Visitors Bureau, helping create special events that bring people to Norfolk, serving with the Downtown Norfolk Association, and other civic obligations that he's volunteered time at to make Norfolk better. And then thirdly, demonstrating a drive and a passion to make Norfolk a better community and help us continue on a wave of growth that we've been experiencing. So all that said, I am proposing that Andrew McCarthy replace Mr. Weebelhaus in this seat for the remainder of his term. And I would open the floor to any discussion or comments before we take a formal vote.
You know, Mayor, I would just make a comment to thank those that did come forward and express an interest in the process. They were exceptional candidates, and I just want to thank them for doing that. It's nice to know that those folks are out there that want to be involved in government, and and I'm sure the decision you made was a difficult one because everybody was so extremely qualified. So,
Yeah, it was not an easy decision. It was tough, and that's a good problem to have.
Absolutely.
In a lot of ways.
absolutely.
So I didn't mention, I also wanted to mention Andrew's background. He's a graduate of Norfolk Catholic High School and earned an Associates of Applied Science degree from Northeast Community College in Marketing and Business. So any other comments or questions on the process? Okay. Hearing none, then I would ask for your votes.
All council members present voting in the affirmative, motion carries.
Okay, congratulations, Andrew. That means you have to be here Monday night to get sworn in. So, all right. And again, thank you, Fred, for your service. Moves us to item number 12, which would have me looking for a motion to consider approval of the council subcommittee recommended budget additions.
I'll make the motion.
Motion and second, and Andy, Randy, okay,
Yes,
for
Your Honor.
background on this, please.
You just approved minutes for the council budget review sessions. After those budget review sessions, for the last budget review session, there was some additions that wanted to have further discussion on, and those were referred to a subcommittee of the council. The budget as it was put together during those budget review sessions did not have a general fund property tax increase. There was a property tax increase of slightly under a cent levy rate increase in the debt service fund to fund flood control bonds budgeted for the flood control recertification. The items that were considered by the subcommittee are listed on the possible additions, changes to the sheet, to the budget you have in front of you. I'll just go down those briefly. First is the city grant for the arts of $25,000. Then there was also talk of the city maintaining landscaping in some of the major corridors where there's landscaping that was installed on that public right-of-way, and the city would take over some of that maintenance on those corridors, and that was budgeted at $75,000. And we also discussed a grant program to reimburse property owners for landscaping on property along the street on some of these more important corridors. That would be an application process they would go through, and with that reimbursement from the city. And then Steve Ramus discussed wayfinding signage. This would be downtown wayfinding signage to direct people to the parking lots and the downtown area. And finally, as we went through the budget and added these items, we were short of our GFOA recommended minimum fund balance, which is 16% of operating expenditures. We're about $549,000 short there. And the subcommittee also recommended that we increase that back up to the GFOA recommended minimum. That results in the subcommittee recommendation of $799,329 increase. That would result in a 4.2 cent levy rate increase. We often refer to this as the taxes on a $100,000 home to make it easy for people to understand how that will impact them. And that would be a $42.47 property tax increase on a $100,000 home. Combining that with the little under 1 cent increase that's already in the debt service fund, gets about a nickel property tax rate increase, or $51.98 on a $100,000 home. Glad to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So maybe you said it and I missed it, but that puts our levy rate at what altogether?
We're currently setting a little about 25.5 cents. This would put our levy rate up to 30.7 cents.
Okay.
And Councilman Merrill asked at the subcommittee meeting how that would put our levy rate in comparison to other first-class cities, and we've handed out today the chart that we always include in our budget showing where we would land. And this chart has everybody's levy rates for the current fiscal year we're in, including Norfolk's, and then where we would be is a black bar on that chart, and would still be the third lowest of the first-class city levy rates, assuming the other cities keep their levy rate the same.
So even at the new rate, slightly increased rate, we would still maintain the third lowest.
Yes, that's
levy
correct.
in the
It'd be just a
state.
little over 30 cents.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you, Randy. Any questions? I know a subcommittee of the council, a couple subcommittees of the council reviewed these recommendations within the last week. But are there any questions or discussion on this at this point?
Yep, just refresh my memory on the recertification of the flood control. How much was that, the total? Was it like 250,000? Do that, right?
The flood control bond we issued this year, that bond, we had provided the funding for that, and we thought that would be the bond that we'd need to get our flood control recertification, but since then costs have went up somewhat, and we also were hoping to get, I think it was $2.5 million of FEMA funding that isn't going to come through. So this would be about $6.5 million of additional debt service that would be needed to, and that takes into account that we're not getting FEMA funding for it and the increased cost. So, yeah, we had that, took the $450,000 that last year would have been was previously going for the LB 840 program, but $175,000 of that towards street, and the other $225,000 into the debt service fund, and that paid for what we were estimating the debt service to be at that time, but this is over and above that, and it's $179,000. $179,000, and that isn't the debt service on that $6.5 million. The debt service on that's more than that, but when we went through our long-term financial plan, that's what we're saying we need to keep the debt service fund balance above the minimum fund balance we've set of $450,000.
Yeah, so that's what we discussed at the budget meetings we had. That was the number that was fresh in my head, so I'm trying to wrap my mind around the additions that we put out from the subcommittee meeting that we're looking at today. So,
Randy, so the FEMA funding did not come through. Is the door closed on that, or is that something that we can take a look at next year?
Steve can probably answer that better than me, but I don't believe we're expecting to get any FEMA funding for this, so probably not.
that would be the correct answer. Once that door closes, you can't really do it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I would just add that being part of this process and the deliberation of these, what I think are reasonable additions, helps improve the city in a number of ways. But I'm particularly interested in the signage program here, and that, just for some background and public record, this has been an effort that's been going for a couple years now to study and do analysis on how we do better signage throughout the community to help people navigate to places of interest in Norfolk as they visit. And the funding specifically dedicated here would help begin that process by acquiring the infrastructure to do so. The signs, which are all part of a consistent branding and marketing campaign for Norfolk, but in this first wave would focus on better identifying available parking in our downtown district, which is a concern, a challenge that I think a lot of us hear sometimes. there is a lot of surface area parking in downtown Norfolk, but it's not currently, in my opinion, signed in the most efficient and effective way to make people aware of it. And so part of the money dedicated here would help to get at that and reform the current system of permits for specific things and open up more parking to be free and to the public where it can be found and navigated to. So I'm excited to get that effort off the ground here. Any other questions or comments, Council?
So, you know, the lion's share of this is the increase in general fund ending balance to target, and that puts us, I think, at, we want to be at 16%?
Yes.
And puts us at about 14 and a half?
This would be at 14.5% without this. This will put us at the 16%.
It does, okay. So this gets us where we need to be and back in that safety zone, which is great. I made a comment in one of the meetings the other day that this particular rise in the levy doesn't have to stay there. And I kind of got laughed at a little bit about that because it's, the general consensus is taxes go up, but they never come down. But I'm here to tell you, as a body, we next year would have the opportunity to take a look at this and reduce that levy down. I think it's very important that we get to that 16% level. We need to protect our community in case there's a disaster that we need that money for. But it certainly doesn't mean that we can't take a look at it next year and see if that number can come back down. So let's be cognizant of that fact at budget time next year.
Thank you, Rob. Any other questions or comments? Any other discussion at the staff level about other budget considerations at this time?
This is the only discussion that would affect property tax, but I think we were also wanting to bring forth a discussion that affects the ARP funding for your consideration also. Steve's talked about Norfolk Transit needing funding from the city, and they have an opportunity now to buy some buses from used buses from an Iowa Transit Authority. I believe you said those were about $84,000, Steve. And that's something that needs to be acted on fairly quickly. And we would be proposing, and Steve's also got other needs to expand the Norfolk Transit services much beyond where they're at today. Steve would probably be better able to talk about that than I would, but there's $300,000 of startup funding, and then also would increase the ongoing match that the city would need of the federal funding dollars to go towards the transit's ongoing operating deficits that are anticipated. And I think what we would be proposing is using ARP dollars to fund an additional, to fund that additional startup cost, buy the buses, and some of the additional operating substance that is needed this first year. This would not be able to, this would mean that we would have to get that funding from some source other than ARP directly, because it can't go to match federal funding. So we'd be looking at taking Keno dollars and increasing the funding for the river improvements we already have in the budget and the CIP, instead of funding those river improvements with ARP dollars, which meets the federal definition of sewer infrastructure. So we'd be funding using ARP dollars to fund $500,000 of the river improvement project, which would free up Keno funding that then could be used to provide the match of those federal dollars and purchase the used buses. you want to expand on any of that, Steve, as our transit expert, but.
Hey, I think Brandon did a great job there of explaining that. Probably just a little bit of update here.
Is your mic on, Steve?
It is.
Okay,
Can you hear me?
all right.
Back in May of this year, there was a presentation to council as well as county commission asking for $1 million from each agency to support expansion of transit here within the community as well as within the county. At that time, we were looking at needing funding for facility expansion in addition to support the increase in service. Within the last week, we can tell there's been some substantial conversations with the other transit provider here in town, specifically Ponca. And we've made some really good headway in terms of our collaboration. And right now, the conversation is around a fairly substantial facility expansion out of Ponca. As a function of that, right now, it looks like they would probably have the capacity to take on that entire cost through their federal partnerships that they have available. So we're kind of parking our portion of that ask, which was fairly significant, and focusing just on the ask that we need to get the flex route system up and operational. That new service would provide 3 essentially fixed routes here in the community. Those routes would have some flexibility to them to have individuals off route within each of the cycles of the route. It is, we've been working with the marketing team for almost a year now to get that prepped to move through the name change. There will be a big public release here on September 8th. That information should start to hit the media. I think the save the date information is ready to roll in this conversation. Likewise, we have committed to the bus purchase. We had the opportunity to pick up 7 low mileage vehicles from a transit authority in the transit system in Iowa. They were in the process of downsizing as a function of other growth and expansion in their area. So we sent staff out there. It was a great opportunity. We did pull the trigger on that. We'll pick up those buses here the first week of September. Should this not happen here in this conversation, we'll look to divest ourselves of those as we figure out what would be next. But we did pull the trigger to control our risk. If we didn't do that and move forward, we were looking upwards of 2 years with the current economy of supply and demand out there to get buses ordered and actually delivered. So that's why we went ahead and moved forward. What I think what the conversation is here, as I understand it, is about a $500,000 ask that Randy rolled through. That would fund a third of our annual operating cost for the flex route system. That cost is estimated in the $300 to $350 range on an annual basis. Going forward, we would be asking the city for 1/3 of that. The other 2/3 of our annual operating costs we would find within other local sponsors. So we're certainly, we think that that's fair ask. The other portion of the funding then would be other startup costs associated with fixed route. Yes, we've purchased, that cover the purchase of the buses. We've got bus wraps, we've got bus stops. There's 93 or 94 bus stops here in the community. We anticipate putting the RFP on the street to have those put in place this fall, and we would expect all the bus stops to be in place by about the first part of November. We need to hire drivers, we need to get drivers trained, we need to get them on their CDL licenses. And then we're going to need to rent space. We're going to have to expand our current office facility and look for additional office space to rent until there's a new facility built. So those are more costs behind there than we'd be happy to share. Big picture on the operations side, this is, once it's up and running fully, we're looking somewhere between $1.8 and $2 million of annual operating expense. decisions that the board's gonna have to make just in terms of, what that revenue component looks like, what our rate charges are. It's a function of working with local partnerships. We are gonna, I believe as a board, that we're gonna be recommending that fixed route service is free to our youth community. 18 and under will have free access to that. There's potential as we work with other funding partners, that they might do something similar for their clientele. Those are some of the big picture things. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have around that.
Did the county appropriate their portion of those funds?
I have not heard any follow-up from the county at this time. The other thing that leads into this is having this gives us the ability now to go out and kind of fanfare the city's commitment to really show that to other grant partners. We want the Northeast Community College as part of our board. We engage in conversations with them about potentially assisting with those local funding needs. The school district is on the board. I would anticipate that we have conversations with them as well. I think having this commitment from the city, will show them that, help with those conversations.
So, and the city hasn't ponied up the money yet either, have we?
No, right now we get I think there's about $35,000 in the budget that we receive annually from the city. We replace that.
So in your efforts going ahead, looking at these buses and outlining what you've outlined, does it seem like you've gotten the cart before the horse a little bit here?
No, if we had to park it, we would park it and pursue those funding conversations. If that's what we have to do, that's what we have to do. But,
I will say, to try to help answer that, having been somewhat close to this process and seeing the reform that's been made in Norfolk public transportation over the last, I don't know, two years. When did the board change, Steve? About 3 years ago. There's been a lot of time and work that's been put into establishing a system and doing the planning. And as we see with any large project, that's the starting point, creating partnerships, making plans, and ultimately, I think we're at a point where we've got a sound plan in place. It has to be funded to work, and so that's why I think we're having this discussion now. Is that accurate? So, in terms of preparation for this to hit the streets, I think we're there. It's a issue of creating the right partnerships to get the funding solution down. And I think from what's already been done to reform the system, you've presented to us before, Steve, on the increase in ridership, and it's been significant in the last year. And a lot of that's come from school kids. And so it's important that we have partners in the school system.
And that we would see that continuing to expand. Transit models for a community of this size with our economic structure, there is somewhere in the range of 107,000 rides a year for our system. And we're currently at around 40. So there's plenty. The need is there. There's substantial need out there for service. I'd also point out back in 2006 when we did the current transportation plan, the 2030 transportation plan, a community survey at that time, survey respondents were asking for an expansion of the Norfolk Public Transfer and bus system back in 2006.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
You said that 250, it's up 250% 2 years ago. And based on what you proposed, that the majority of that would be free rides. 18 and under.
About third or fourth. I think about a third of our ridership right now is youth, and that's developed within the last year. About a third of our ridership
See, the healthcare, hospital and healthcare systems are part of there's members of those agencies on the board, correct? And they'll be asked to be a donor to this.
Conversations with those board members that have some capacity, and we'll also pursue external grant partners as well. We also receive funding from United Way, and our Medicaid reimbursement is also used to offset. So you kind of ran through those numbers quickly earlier on in your discussion. I'm the transit system, Josh, I agree with you. A lot of people put a lot of time in this, and it's a good thing for our community. I'm just going back now and look at numbers, you know, really. As it shakes out, I know we've got some grant money, there will be grant money available, and we've got other options right now that we haven't had in the past to do this now. I get that. So what do you think is a long-term obligation for our city budget to finance this going forward, minus the funding we have from outside sources? I would say, I anticipate that in today's dollars being about $115,000 a year. Right now, you're funding 35. So of that 115, is that been put back into this goals budget already? That is part of the current tax. Okay.
Part of the current ask that this year would be funded through the Keno that we're shifting over, that will be filled in by ARP. Yeah. So, okay.
Just a little confusing because we're at a budget, we're at a special meeting, obviously, to accept your recommendation of our new council member. We're going into a discussion about buses that I wasn't prepared for. And, so it's just kind of. This is, the ARP dollars can be transferred by municipality to a transit organization that's providing transit. The litmus test there is that if you could do that as a municipality, then you could transfer it for that purpose. And so this is a conversation about exchanging ARP dollars for some Keno dollars, because the ARP can be used for stormwater management, which the river restoration project is. I know a lot of our Keno dollars and council priority dollars have been tied up. We've got them allocated out 10 years in some cases. What does this do to affect what we have current allocations?
Your,
Kind of like we're talking about just the things that we allocate for our placeholders for that. How's that affect us?
your council priority dollars now are allocated, like you said, for the next 10 years. A portion of those for debt service on this building, I believe that's about $125,000. That varies from year to year, but about $125,000. The rest of that is available for other types of council priorities. And the idea, there's been some talk of allocating those by ward, where the councilman in the wards could then direct a portion of the.
I was just made aware of it.
Sometimes we lump the Keno and council priority together on certain projects when it comes into like portable, these are already dedicated Keno dollars to a project. We're just pulling those out. Oh, wait, that's yeah, exactly. What, I guess you can't really specify what projects are gonna take a hit, because it'd be, they're gonna take a hit, they're gonna be, because this is long-term commitment, this is $115K per budget per year forever.
Yes, we've already got about 36,000 in our budget, so your increase is a net of about 80-some thousand that we would need to find an ongoing funding source for when we're putting the budget together next year.
The 115, right, the total.
Well, yeah, we've already got 36,000 of that as a built into our current budget, but we need to come up with the additional going forward, long-term, from some sort of ongoing funding source, not a one-time funding source like the ARP money is.
115,000 would come out of here. Funded by that. That's our obligation.
That's our share of the local match for the federal and state dollars that are coming in.
Which is long. It's once we pass, it's forever. It's 115K.
So to your point, for this first year, I don't mean covered through the ARP and the Keno, but yes, the operational expense moving forward, and that's a consideration we need to make. I think to get back, and Shane, you raised a good point too. The timing of this, are we talking about it right now? Placed under this, the recommended budget additions. I think the most urgent part of this is acquiring the buses, right? And that is something that there's a window on that, correct? Can you speak to that a little bit?
As I mentioned, we did commit to the purchase of the buses so that we didn't lose that opportunity. We would expect to go get those that first week of September, and I would anticipate that you'd like to check at that time.
First week of September?
How many buses was it again? I'm sorry.
7.
Seven.
There's 3 routes, there's 2 buses on a route in the peak times, 1 bus on each route during off-peak times, and there's a bus for standby.
Steve, you gave us a presentation on this in late May, I think it was. Is that correct? Okay. Is there a chance in the next couple, 3 weeks that you would be able to update that presentation with the information you've garnered since the end of May and let either subcommittee know so we can sit down and make a educated judgment and decision on this? Because I think right now I sense a little confusion in terms of the dollars, where they're going and all of that. Not that I'm opposed to the project, because I think that the city does need something like that, but I am a little bit confused by the numbers.
The transit board would be more than happy to come and present an update.
Great. Okay. Yeah, as
So-
soon as possible, obviously.
In terms, again, of timing with the acquisition of the buses, and then any consequences for the budget process itself. So, do we have? Yeah, I agree. The process would be strengthened by having some time to deliberate on the larger funding component of this and the ongoing operations, and how we sit down and say, if this is a priority, how are we gonna dedicate funds moving forward? But there's also a part of this where there's an opportunity to move now on the buses that probably doesn't come around a lot, because we're talking about 7 buses with pretty low mileage for a total commitment of 84,000. Yeah. Is there a way to separate this out in which, no, 84 altogether, aggregate, right?
That's correct. Okay. 12,000 buses.
12,000 a bus right now that we would need to implement this system.
15 passenger transit buses. They all have at least the ability to hold 2 non-ambulatory individuals. Mileage, the lower mileages are in the teens. There's a couple there that are one or two in the 30s, and there's one bus at 40. So it's in general pretty low mileage, great maintenance records on them. And they all come from one system. We're familiar with that system, their staff, their maintenance records.
Yeah. And I understand some of the partners involved some have made commitments to help cover the expense of these buses, and some are being asked, right? So there will be other funders helping pay for the acquisition of these buses. Is that correct?
We're looking for the city to really help us. We're looking, as part of this big ask, where we're gonna go to the local funders is more on long-term operational costs. So that the other 2/3 of that 300 to 350,000 is where we're seeking partners locally.
That bigger, broader cost. Yeah.
Right now, the conversation is for the upfront cost to get going, it's an ask to the city for the flat route system.
So is it fair process-wise to give some kind of indication, if we want to today, to make a commitment of up to that 84,000 to acquire the buses, and then schedule subcommittee review for the larger budget question for the system within the next few weeks? And then my question is, does that give us time, if we choose to move forward, to enshrine that in this budget document.
No, it doesn't, but the ARP budget itself would not change. Right now, we've got all 4.3 million of funding in the ARP budget going towards infrastructure because we're not sure exactly where we're going to put that. But the 500,000, if we did decide that we want to do that whole 500,000 towards the improvements on the river, that would be infrastructure in the ARP regardless of how we did that. It would change the way we would have probably budget some money in and out of the capital projects fund, but that's relatively minor. If you guys want to look at this further, we can sure do that. We will leave the budget the way it is now, and because it's substantially the way I would envision changing it if we gave this our blessing today. There's some minor changes within the capital project fund and some other as far as what's funding sources for the river improvements. But we can get the council's blessing later on to change that. It really won't change materially how this budget looks now, because the budget for the ARP dollars will be infrastructure regardless of what we do for funding Norfolk Transit.
Okay.
So I'd say leave the budget the way it is now for that, and we'll make our decisions later on, or the council will make their decisions later on that bigger piece of funding. As long as we've got the okay, I think you need that soon, Steve, on the $84,000 for the buses, which would come from Keno.
And you're asking for the 84,000 out of the Keno funds, right?
I'll say it again.
Well, you're asking for the 84,000 out of our Keno dollars for the buses, to fund the buses.
Yes, that would come from Keno. That I would envision the Keno that would have been going for the river improvements would then be that 84,000 would be funded. That would have went for river improvements would be funded from the ARP money.
So I'm sitting up here, Councilman, I'm trying to, today, and this is where I'm having struggles a little bit. Came here today with a .042 increase in our taxes, 0.042% increase. When I left the budget meeting the other day, I was sitting about .021, leaving when people left that night, from ours, and then went to subcommittee, went up to .042 with the additions of the 250K on top of that. And then now we were asking for 115, essentially long-term for these buses. I know it's 84,000 asked today, but 115 to fund moving forward, which is coming out of Keno, which in my mind says, okay, next year, this time, if one of us doesn't like the fact that we're funding our buses out of our Keno fund, because Keno fund typically goes to recreation, and not to, we're gonna be asking for another 115,000 next year to fund the buses, because we'll be underfunded. Do you follow me?
I think
That's
you're,
what I'm looking at now, I know it's coming out of Keno dollars, but essentially, you've got an $800,000 deficit. We're gonna try to fund through increasing taxes, right? So we wanna get our general budget back up to, we wanna make sure we got that 16% with the 550,000. So I'm kinda sitting here going, I'm not saying that anything on it is wrong, it's just presentation today has got me kind of baffled.
I think what you're saying, Councilman, is pretty much correct. A year down the road, we got this long-term funding. Going forward, we were not planning on the operating subsidy from the city coming from Keno. It would come from some other funding source. The Keno going forward would continue to go to the parks. As Councilman Merrill, I believe, mentioned that this property tax increase we're asking for today does not include all ongoing expenditures. For instance, the wayfinding signage is a one-time thing. that may be something that could be redirected towards this. I'm just throwing out ideas that we would consider much more fully as we put the budget together next year. But that would be one example of maybe that's where we could get the funding. But
Rob, what you just stated earlier, maybe we don't always have to keep taxes where they're at, we can lower them, right? We just build that bracket, we'll do it, if we don't want to pay for Montezuma funds long term. So I'm just,
Sure. That's all part of the discussion. I would just remind, again, looking at this chart where we are with property tax levies, even with these additions, again, we're at about 30 cents, which puts us third lowest in the state of Nebraska. And, you know, with growth, I don't think anybody can deny the community's growing, and with growth there comes new needs. And finding responsible ways to finance those. None of these things on this list, I think, are unreasonable or outlandish in accordance with the growth that we've seen in the community. So adjusting our budget accordingly in a very moderate, reasonable way to fund them, I think is part of our job as elected officials.
I don't disagree with you, Josh. We are sitting at the bottom as far as the facts go, and I think council's done a good job of the years maintaining that. Our retail sales have been strong in this community to allow us to do that. So is it time to maybe look at that increase in general fund ending balance? Are we 10 years I've been here, we've hardly ever been at that 16%.
one time,
One time.
budget.
So I know we're trying to maintain that, but is this the year to do it? You know, I mean, because we've had these extra costs this year that we weren't expecting. You know, we've got obviously some of that certification for our flood control, some that we were not expecting. You know, we had the flood, thank God that thing was built the way it was to protect our community, and I can see where that on an ask of about 200,000 is good of the budget to pay for that. I mean, that's not funded from other areas. That's coming, that's the ask out of our general fund. That's not, you know what I'm saying? That we're not getting funded from other areas that aren't for property tax or retail or whatever for our general fund. So is it time to look at that and say, listen, we've got these other increases, we're asking for $150K out of Kingdom dollars, or do we need to be at a full 16%? Or do we just need to be right there at it? And I get, because I would like to see us start talking about a different way to fund 115 more long term, and not just all pay Kingdom dollars. This we've always done the past, Kingdom dollars and council priority dollars. You know, hey, let's just do that. We'll make it work. Then all of a sudden, they're all used up. And I think a couple years ago we were like, we don't want to pay wages out of council priority dollars, and the staff did a good enough job that they moved it out of there, and the council priority dollars were there again. I just feel like, does that have to be 550,000, I guess? Or is that important to us that we have to maintain that 60% even when we've had some things happen that were out of our control?
I think the 16%, from my perspective, the 16% has always been the standard, right? That we seek to get to have that rainy day fund, that emergency fund to utilize should we need it. I think that's smart budgeting. I think you keep a goal in mind. I don't think that's 16% outlandish or too much. I like the fact that we can get close to getting there, and it gives us some security. I mean, it's like your family budget. You try to keep a certain amount in savings for unpredictable things. So I do think that is important. And we've had some discussion on this. We did briefly discuss it during budget review, and then a subcommittee reviewed it as part of that. So I think that's reasonable. I think the decision we have to make today in terms of time, and what I'm hearing is that we need some time to digest the ask for the bigger transit system and how we fund that going forward. And I think that's reasonable to do that. But when we're looking at a infrastructure expense on acquiring the fleet needed to do it, and we have this kind of one unique opportunity, one-time support through ARP to help fund that, that makes sense to me to go forward and meet the timeline needed to the timeline that's required to get those purchases made. So I would think it's reasonable if the council agrees to, along with these budget additions, indicate some kind of commitment or not on the 84,000 to acquire the buses today, and then decide when we have time to sit down and look at the broader system funding ask to make a decision on that then. So to kind of separate out those decisions, if that makes sense.
Those buses need to be paid for in full, or can you make a down payment?
Don't know the answer to that. I would assume that they would want payment in full. If we had to do it down,
And you said it was that would need to take place by the end of the first week in September? So we would have a couple of weeks to have an updated presentation from you to decide whether we would want to invest that $84,000.
So the first council meeting, September, could be an agenda item.
Or a public services subcommittee?
Sure, before that. Yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
saying that the process for
Oh,
the
sure.
full council to review it
Yeah,
could
okay.
be at that first meeting in September.
I would feel comfortable with that.
I would agree.
Yeah. I would, and I think it's a point worth making here too. This is a good thing. Transit, the state came to us 3 years ago, whenever it was, and said, look, your public transit system's not working the way it's supposed to. It's not accessible to the full community. It's catering to just a subset of the population. If you want continued funding through the state, you have to change it. Steve, with his experience in this, stepped up and took on the challenge, almost wholesale reformed that system to broaden it, make it better, more efficient, more accessible to people that there's clearly need to use it. I mean, I think we need to be careful up here. Does any of us use public transportation? So that voice is not being represented here. There's need in people using it. And those are people that need it to get to school, to get to medical appointments, important stuff. Let's remember them in this discussion as well.
I would have no reason to think that I would ever forget them. But I would like an updated,
I'll carry that message back to the board.
yeah.
We'll get a meeting here.
And I don't disagree, Mayor, that it's needed.
No, they did, staff's did a tremendous job with the ARP dollars.
Yeah.
On how to do this.
I
And
agree.
the fact that you found 7 buses for 84,000, I think is pretty remarkable. That has I have no bearing on my thought process whatsoever. That's a great deal. Problem is with that 60%, I feel like we're pushing pretty hard for a 0.042 increase, and then a long-term debt of another 115,000. That's why my mind's stuck on that 115. What we're gonna do with
And if it's priority enough, if we decide that this is priority enough to make this system accessible to people or it helps people, then I would think that we're all reasonable enough to find a way to fund priorities. So, all right. So to come to some kind of conclusion here, the underlying motion is consideration of approval of the council subcommittee recommended budget additions that were discussed. And it sounds like there's intent to further examine the transit system, including the $84,000 acquisition of buses in fairly short order to place on a council agenda the first week of September. Is that all fair?
I think so.
Okay. So any further discussion? Okay. Hearing none, please vote.
Voting in the affirmative, Arns, Merrill, Jackson, Murian, Hildebrand. Voting in opposition, Lawson. Motion carries.
Okay, with that, that concludes this special meeting of the Norfolk City Council. We are adjourned.